At my son's wedding, my sister lifted her glass toward his boss, smiled the way she always smiles when she wants something badly, and introduced me to a room full of strangers as the unemployed one who lives off the family. A fork stopped halfway to somebody's mouth. An entire table of people I had never met in my life turned slowly to look at me all at once. I laughed. I had practiced that laugh in my bathroom mirror for weeks, standing there alone in the early morning light, rehearsing the exact pitch of it so it would come out light and unbothered instead of broken. Then the man standing beside her set his glass down on the white linen, slow and careful and deliberate, the way a person sets something down when they are no longer interested in holding it. And I watched my sister Carolyn's smile freeze on her face, like a photograph of a woman who had just realized the ground beneath her was not solid after all. What none of them knew, not Carolyn, not the strangers at that table, not the waitstaff moving quietly around us, was that the man she had spent the entire evening trying to impress had spent the last 3 years actively trying to find me. Welcome to Story Sentence, where we sit with the quiet women nobody counts, the sisters and daughters and mothers the world decides to overlook, right up until the room discovers exactly who it has been talking to this whole time. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe now, because this one goes places nobody saw coming. My name is Diana Harlow, and I am 47 years old. For most of that wedding reception, I stood near the edge of the Lakeside Estate's grand hall with a glass of white wine going warm in my hand, watching the string lights reflect off the water outside and listening to the band play something soft and forgettable. I have gotten very good at edges over the last few years.
3 years ago, I would not have known where the edge of a room was, because I was always at the center of one, usually at the head of the conference table, usually the one everyone waited on before the meeting could properly begin. I built a career in corporate strategy that people in my industry wrote actual case studies about. I ran strategy for companies whose names appear on the side of buildings in every major city in this country. I did it without a wealthy father, or a convenient marriage, or a soft place to land when things got hard. Self-made, they used to call me, back when anyone in that world still called me anything at all. Now I was the woman standing near the coat check, watching my son Marcus laugh with his brand new wife Vivian, feeling the strange and almost unbearable peace of someone who has already lost the thing she was most afraid of losing, and discovered, to her own amazement, that she survived it anyway.
Marcus looked so much like my mother when he smiled wide like that. Nobody at that reception knew that. Nobody there had sat beside a hospital bed for 2 full years, or understood what those 2 years had quietly and methodically emptied out of a life. To them, I was simply Carolyn's sister, the one without a job, the one you are politely kind to, the way you are kind to someone who has clearly fallen on hard times. I let them believe it. I had learned over the course of 3 very long years that being underestimated is its own kind of quiet power. But underestimation is a loan, never a gift, and the collection always comes eventually. The call came on a Tuesday morning, a little more than 3 years before Marcus's wedding, and I remember it precisely because I was standing inside a glass conference room 40 floors above the city when my phone lit up with my mother's name. I was 4 days away from being formally named managing partner of the firm I had given 2 decades of my life to. 20 years. I had spent 20 years reaching for that specific door, and it was finally, genuinely swinging open for me. I stepped out of the room to take the call, half annoyed at the interruption, and my mother said the word pancreatic, and then she said stage 4, and the 40 floors of city below me seemed to go absolutely silent. She was 69 years old. The doctors gave her numbers, and the numbers were very small. And I stood in that hallway doing the only math that had ever mattered, and the answer was clear before I had finished the calculation. I could keep the door, or I could keep the time. I did not agonize the way people might expect. I went back into that conference room, and I told the partners I was withdrawing my name from consideration. And I watched 20 years quietly rearrange themselves into something I didn't have a word for yet. Carolyn was living in a different city then, doing well for herself, and I called her that same night. My sister said something to me during that call, something quick and casual and seemingly light, that I did not fully understand for 3 entire years. When I finally understood it, I understood everything else about her too, all of it, including the particular cruelty of what she would do to me at her nephew's wedding. But that understanding came much later, at a table with white flowers and a powerful man setting down his glass. That night, I only heard the words and let them go, the way you release something you don't yet know you'll need. Here is the thing people have always gotten wrong about Carolyn and me. We were both asked. When it became clear that our mother could not safely be alone, the family had the kind of meeting that happens over a conference call with too many people talking and nobody really listening. Someone said it plainly enough. One of us would need to step back from her career. Carolyn was a manager at a consulting firm then, mid-level, working hard and visibly terrified of losing the position she'd clawed up to. When the question landed, she said it immediately, almost before anyone had finished speaking. I can't just throw away everything I've built. She said it fast, like she'd rehearsed the sentence, like she needed us to hear the certainty before we had a chance to hear the refusal underneath it. And the painful truth is that in that moment, I understood her. I have since thrown away everything I've built. I know the exact weight of that. Carolyn was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman who had climbed a long ladder in the rain for years and could not imagine voluntarily releasing a single rung. So I said I would do it. I said it the way you say yes to the thing nobody else will touch, half pride and half love, without knowing yet that the world keeps 2 entirely different sets of books, one for the people who stay visible and one for the people who walk out of the light. I did not resent her for it then. I want to be completely honest about that, because this story deserves honesty. The resentment came much later, and it did not come from the caregiving itself. It came from what Carolyn decided the caregiving meant about me. 2 years is an enormous length of time when it is measured in medication schedules and specialist appointments and the particular silence of a hospital corridor at 3 in the morning. I learned the language of oncology the way I once learned the language of corporate mergers, fluently and entirely against my will. I sold my apartment and moved into something considerably smaller so that the numbers would stretch far enough. I drove my mother to appointments that began at 6 in the morning, and I learned which nurses were genuinely gentle and which were merely efficient. My phone, which had once buzzed all day long with people who needed my analysis and my judgment and my decisions, went quiet over several months, and then it went essentially dead. And I did not have the energy left over to grieve that loss on top of everything else that was being lost. Some nights my mother would surface from the haze of the medications and look at me with a clarity that was almost startling, like a light switching on in a dark room. One of those nights she held my hand and said something I have carried like a stone in my coat pocket ever since. She looked straight at me and said, "They will measure you by the room you're standing in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way." I told her she was being overly dramatic. She reminded me that she was dying and had therefore earned the right to be dramatic if she chose. We both laughed, and it was a real laugh, not the practiced kind, and I will keep that laugh somewhere safe for the rest of my life. That was the last good week. There is a particular mercy in not knowing which week is the last one, until it has already passed behind you. My mother died in the spring, and something quietly strange happened at her funeral. People began speaking about me in the past tense. Not about her, about me. An aunt patted my arm and said what a shame it was about what I had given up, wasn't it? And how I used to be so impressive back when I was doing things. Carolyn flew in for 2 days, wore beautiful black, and cried in a way that made several people rush to comfort her. By the end of the reception, she had somehow become the primary grieving daughter, and I had become the tired woman who had simply been handling the logistics. She told a cousin warmly that she was so worried about me and hoped I could find my footing again, as though I had wandered off a hiking trail, rather than carried our mother all the way to the end of hers. I stood in my mother's kitchen, holding a casserole dish someone had brought, and I felt the entire story of the last 2 years being quietly and efficiently rewritten around me by people who had not been present for a single day of it. Die's the thing nobody warns you about when you step out of your visible life to do the invisible work of caregiving. You give up the lit room, and then the people still standing in their lit rooms get to narrate what your time in the dark was worth. Carolyn was already constructing her version of events, and her version did not cast me as anything worth remembering. It cast me as a cautionary tale. A year passed slowly. I handled the paperwork of death, which is its own considerable second job that nobody talks about, and I let myself feel very little for a long time. And gradually, I started sleeping through the night again. Then Marcus called, and it was the best news I had received in years. He was getting married. He had met Vivian, and she was kind and grounded, and clearly unmistakably good for him in the way that matters. When he asked me to be there, my whole chest ached with something that was not grief for the first time in longer than I could remember. But near the end of that phone call, my son went quiet in a particular way, and then he said the thing that told me with complete precision exactly where I stood in the current version of the family story. He said, "Mom, Aunt Carolyn is going to be there, and she has her whole thing about you being between jobs, and can you maybe not engage with it? For me? It's just 1 day." He was 25 years old and terrified of a scene at his own wedding, and I could hear in his voice that he loved me and was ashamed of himself for asking in exactly the same breath. I said, "Of course, honey, of course I will," and I meant every word. And it cost me something I did not yet have a proper name for. Because in that single gentle sentence, my own son had told me which sister was the problem to be carefully managed. Not the one who mocked, the one who might reasonably object to being mocked. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my small apartment for a long time. Then I thought to ask him, gently and casually, where it was he worked again, this firm he mentioned being so proud of. He told me the name like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, Apex Meridian Consulting. I kept my voice completely even and said that was a solid firm, a good place to learn. And he said, yeah, Aunt Carolyn had actually helped him get the interview because she was a senior manager there, and he was just an analyst still, but he was learning an enormous amount from the environment. I told him I was proud of him, and I genuinely was. And I did not tell him what that name meant to me, because I knew Apex Meridian. I had competed against Apex Meridian for nearly a decade. I had beaten them on major pitches and lost to them on others. And years ago, early in my career when I was still building my reputation, I had developed a framework, a proprietary methodology for mapping a company's actual decision-making patterns against its publicly stated strategies, revealing the gap between what organizations said they did and what they actually did when the pressure was real. That framework had traveled around the industry the way good intellectual property travels when it isn't properly protected, quietly and without attribution, borrowed and adapted and absorbed, until it became simply the way certain firms thought about problems. The last I had heard before I stepped away from everything, Apex Meridian had adopted a version of it as their core analytical methodology. By now it would be simply house knowledge there, the invisible foundation everyone stood on, without remembering that the foundation had ever had an architect. And here is the part that landed in my chest like something cold. Carolyn had spent her entire career at Apex Meridian. She had climbed every rung of that particular ladder, standing on a foundation built from my work, without a single reason to know whose name had once been on it. She had never once thought to ask me anything real about who I had been before I became the cautionary tale. I could have told Marcus that night.
I need you to understand that I deliberately chose not to. Not because I had some clever long-term plan. I was simply so exhausted of being the woman who had to explain that she used to matter. Let them find out or not. I was going to a wedding to watch my son be happy, and I owed no one my professional biography. What I did not know yet was that before the wedding weekend was over, the truth would find its own way into the light without any help from me at all. But there was something else I discovered during that phone call that I haven't told you about yet, something that would matter more than any of it. 6 months before Marcus's wedding, I had started writing again. Nothing public, nothing with my name on it, just a strategy blog I ran anonymously, working through problems in corporate decision-making, publishing pieces that I wrote mostly to keep my own mind from going completely quiet. I had maybe 200 readers on a good week, or so I thought. I would come back to this. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday evening. Vivian's family had quiet money, the kind that doesn't announce itself, and the rehearsal dinner was held in a private room at a restaurant called the Harrington House, an old converted manor house on the edge of the city, where the waitstaff folded your napkin back into an architectural shape when you stepped away from the table for 2 minutes. I wore the one good dress I had kept from my previous life, and felt like a museum exhibit of my former self, something behind glass that people walk past without stopping. Vivian's parents were gracious in the careful way of people who are not quite sure what category to put you in, and Carolyn, my sister, walked into that room like she had personally reserved it. She wore success like an expensive fragrance. She had a new watch and a newer confidence, and within 10 minutes she had assembled a small court near the window where she held court, telling stories that all seemed to conclude with her being uniquely right about something important. I watched my son watch her with something I recognized as envy, and I understood the shape of the entire evening before it had properly begun. Carolyn was the family's designated success story tonight, and every story that has a success needs a contrast somewhere in the frame. I got a glass of wine and found a chair near the edge of the room, which by now felt less like exile and more like an excellent observation post. From the edge, you see everything clearly. From the edge, you see who a person actually is when they believe the important people are watching. Carolyn spent the entire rehearsal dinner glancing toward the door, waiting for someone who mattered more than the rest of us to arrive. The person she was waiting for did not come to the rehearsal dinner, but his name came up in every third sentence. My CEO, she kept saying, with a particular emphasis. Richard is incredibly selective about the events he attends. She told a long, elaborate story about a presentation she had given him, about how demanding he was, how he had once rejected an entire strategic deck in front of the whole team, how she had stayed awake all night rebuilding it from scratch,
and won him over by 6 the next morning. She said his name with the reverence of someone lighting a candle at a shrine. Richard Calloway. She dropped it in front of Vivian's father, who nodded pleasantly. She dropped it in front of Marcus, who beamed because his aunt reported directly to the great man, and wasn't that remarkable. And she dropped it while looking at me, I noticed, as if to make absolutely certain I understood the distance between a woman who stood in Richard Calloway's orbit and a woman who stood next to the co-check. I sipped my wine and said nothing at all. The name meant nothing to me yet. I had stepped away from the industry before Calloway's tenure at the top of Apex Meridian and had never crossed paths with him. But Carolyn didn't know that either. She simply knew that I used to be someone and was now apparently no one. And she wanted the someone who used to live inside me to clearly understand how far she had risen since then. She wanted an audience for her ascent. She had no idea she was about to get one that would change everything. It was Vivian's mother who asked me at the salad course, gently and sincerely, "And what do you do, Diana?" A simple question, the most human kind. I opened my mouth to answer it honestly, to say that I had stepped back from consulting to care for my mother and was now thinking carefully about what I wanted to build next, which was the truth and not a thing to be ashamed of. But Carolyn answered for me before I had spoken a single word. She laughed, a light and airy laugh, and said, "Oh, Diana's between things right now. She's been between things for quite a while now, actually." She said it with unmistakable fondness, which was the particular genius of it. She wrapped the knife in warmth so that anyone who flinched at the blade would appear to be overreacting. Vivian's mother smiled uncertainly and steered the conversation elsewhere, and I sat there having been introduced to my son's new family as a woman defined entirely by absence, between things, as though I were an empty hallway connecting rooms where more important people lived.
As though the 2 years I had spent holding a dying woman's hand through the long nights were a blank space in a timeline, rather than the fullest and most complete work I had ever done in my life. I felt the old professional part of me, the part that had faced hostile boardrooms and walked away winning, go very still and very cold inside my chest. I said, "That's one way to describe it, Carolyn." And I let it drop, because it was Marcus's weekend, and I had made a promise. But I filed it. Some words you file for later. I slipped outside after the entree to stand in the cool night air and breathe for a moment, and Vivian followed me. My son had married up in the only way that has ever actually mattered. She was the kind of person who notices when someone has gone quiet in a way that has weight to it. She stood beside me in the dark and didn't try to fill the silence immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about her. Then she said, "Marcus told me you took care of your mom for a couple of years. That must have been genuinely hard." And that was the whole thing. That was all of it. She asked me about the actual life I had lived, instead of the gap it had left in my resume. I told her some of it. The 6 a.m. drives through empty streets, the nurses who were gentle versus the ones who were only efficient, the last good week when my mother was clear and present and laughing. Vivian listened the way certain people listen, like what you are saying is actually worth something. At one point she said quietly, "That's not nothing, you know. That's kind of everything." I had to look away at the darkness for a moment and collect myself. It is a strange and particular feeling to have your son's wife be the first person in 3 years to hand you back a small piece of yourself you thought was simply gone. When we went back inside, Carolyn was midway through another story, and Vivian caught my eye across the room and made a small and private face that said, "I see exactly what's happening here, and I'm not fooled by it." I had an ally.
I didn't know yet how much comfort that would give me, or how little, in the end, I would actually need to call on it. The moment that I keep returning to happened over dessert, and it happened, of all things, with business cards. Vivian's father mentioned in passing that he had been thinking about bringing in some outside strategy consulting for his company in the coming year. Nothing firm yet, just turning the idea over. And Carolyn moved toward that opening, the way a fast-closing door moves. Efficient and inevitable.
She reached into her bag and produced her business cards. Apex Meridian Consulting, embossed cleanly in deep navy blue, her full name and her title in precise type, and she fanned them across the white tablecloth like a winning hand of cards, and slid them toward Vivian's father with her most polished smile. Then she turned to me. She let the pause sit just long enough for the entire table to feel its weight, and she said, "Do you have one to give them, Diana? Anything at all?" The table went quiet, with the specific silence of people who understand that a question is not really a question. Everyone at that table understood what she was actually asking. She was asking whether I existed, and I did not have a card. I had left my old cards in a desk drawer 3 years ago, along with everything else from that life, and I had not made new ones because I had not yet settled on what they would say.
So I sat there, empty-handed, in front of my son and his new family, while my sister's little navy cards lay fanned across the white linen, like evidence of who was real and who was merely present. I smiled and said, "No, I'm completely fresh out." Carolyn smiled back, satisfied in a way that settled into her shoulders, and the dessert plates arrived. And the moment passed for everyone at that table, except for me. I would carry those fanned navy cards in my mind all the way through to the reception the following evening. If you have ever sat at a table holding nothing, while someone spread their credentials like a winning hand and asked you, in front of people who mattered to you, whether you had anything at all, leave me a comment below. Did you smile too? Stay with me. This one turns. And it turns hard. That night, back in the small room I was staying in, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I opened my laptop and looked at my anonymous strategy blog. The one I had been writing for the past 6 months with no name attached, no biography, just the work itself. I had posted a new piece 3 weeks earlier about the gap between stated organizational values and actual decision behavior, essentially a refinement of the framework I had built years ago. I had never checked the traffic numbers carefully. I looked that night. The piece had been shared 900 times, and there were 2 comments from someone with the initials RC, who had written in 2 separate visits 3 weeks apart that whoever wrote this had done the foundational thinking his entire firm's analytical approach rested on, and that he had spent years looking for the original author. 2 comments. RC. I did not connect it that night. I was too tired, and the letters meant nothing to me yet. I closed the laptop and took out an old photograph I kept in my purse. My mother and me at an industry conference maybe 15 years ago, both of us laughing at something outside the frame, me in a lanyard and blazer, her having flown in just to watch me give a keynote she didn't understand a single technical word of. She used to do that, sit in the back of rooms where her daughter was the expert and beam like a woman who had won something. I sat on the floor of that room, and I asked myself the question I had been outrunning for 3 years. If I produce nothing visible, am I anything? If no one is measuring me, do I still count? It is an ugly question to catch yourself asking. It meant some part of me had begun to believe Carolyn's arithmetic, the arithmetic that says a woman without a title is a woman without worth. I did not cry. I sat with the question and let it be honest for once, because you cannot address a rot you refuse to name. My mother's voice came back to me from that last good week. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way.
I put the photograph back in my purse. I wanted her at the wedding. The morning of the wedding, Marcus needed help with his tie. He has always needed help with his tie, and I suspect he always will, and I have decided that is perfectly fine with me. He came to me in the small anteroom off the estate's chapel, with the ends of it hanging completely loose, and that particular helpless look he has worn since he was 6 years old and couldn't figure out how zippers worked. I stepped in and did the knot the way my own father taught me to do it, with the small tuck that keeps it from sliding. His hands were trembling slightly. Just nerves. I smoothed his collar and looked at my son in his suit, and had to breathe very carefully for a moment. He looked at me in the small mirror propped against the wall. Both of us reflected in it together. And for a brief second, his face crumpled at the edges, and he said, "Mom, about what I asked you on the phone? About Aunt Carolyn? That wasn't fair of me."
I know it wasn't. I told him it was completely fine. He said, "It's just she gets loud, and I didn't want..." And I stopped him gently. I said, "Honey, this is your day. I am not going to be a single ounce of trouble in it. That is a promise, and I mean it as a gift, not a sacrifice." He hugged me too hard, the way he did when he was small and frightened of thunderstorms. Over his shoulder, through the small window, I could see the lakeside estate laid out in morning light, white chairs arranged in rows, early guests arriving, Vivian's family moving with the ease of people accustomed to occasions like this one. I had promised Marcus peace, and I fully intended to keep that promise. What I could not have predicted was that peace was not going to be mine to keep or break. Someone else was going to reach for the pin. The ceremony was beautiful and blessedly short, which is the correct length for a ceremony. Then came the reception in the estate's long lakeside hall, with its open sides looking out over the water, wisteria climbing the support columns, candles and string lights everywhere, doing their work in the early evening air. They had seated me at a table well back from the main action, with Vivian's great-aunt Eleanor, 2 of Vivian's college friends, and a quietly pleasant man named Jeffrey, who seemed content to watch everything without commenting on any of it. I understood the seating arrangement. The front tables were for the people the day was performing itself for. I sipped wine and watched my sister work the room from a comfortable distance. I have always been able to see the whole board from the edge. What I saw was Carolyn orbiting one man in particular all evening, a silver-haired man in his mid-50s, in a suit that fit as though it had been constructed around him specifically, calm in the particular way of people who have been genuinely powerful long enough that they no longer need to signal it. He took up precisely as much space as he needed, and not a single inch more. Carolyn circled him continuously. She refreshed his drink. She laughed a precise beat too long at whatever he said. She touched his arm when she wanted to redirect his attention. Even from the back of the hall, I could read the choreography clearly, because I had once been the person rooms arranged themselves around, and I knew exactly what it looked like when someone wanted that arrangement desperately. I did not yet know who he was. I only knew I had seen that particular dance before, from a different position in the room. Then Carolyn looked across the hall, found me at my back table, and began walking toward me, with the man beside her. And I understood with complete clarity what was coming, the way you understand weather before it arrives. She had decided I was scenery for this scene.
She wanted to demonstrate to her CEO how warmly she carried her unfortunate, less successful sister. Some people build themselves up by building something. Carolyn had only ever learned to build herself up by standing on someone smaller. And tonight, the someone was me, at her nephew's wedding, in front of the most important professional witness in her life. I set my warm glass of wine down. I straightened my back, the way I used to before walking into rooms where people had assembled specifically to tell me no. An old reflex. Muscle memory from a life these people had decided I'd never had. Across the hall, I saw Vivian spot the trajectory and begin moving, though she was too far away to reach me in time.
Marcus was near the head table, laughing at something, completely unaware of what was crossing the floor toward me. And Carolyn arrived at my table with the calm, silver-haired man at her elbow, glowing with the particular light of someone who believes they are about to win something. She gestured at me with an open hand, the way a television host gestures at a prize behind a curtain, and she turned to the man beside her and said, "Richard, this is my sister I was telling you about. Diana, the unemployed one. She's been between things for years and years, bless her heart." She said it, smiling. That was the genius and the cruelty of it together. She wrapped the knife so thoroughly in warmth that anyone who reacted would look oversensitive. The great aunt beside me inhaled through her nose. One of Vivian's college friends examined her dessert plate with sudden, intense concentration. And I did the thing I had spent 3 years training myself to do when being narrated by people who had never been present for my actual life. I laughed. It was almost gentle. And then I looked at the man, this Richard, and I said the truest and quietest thing available to me in that moment. "She's right," I said. "I don't have a title anymore." I meant it as a kind of surrender, a white flag. "You win this one, Carolyn. I'm not going to fight you here at your nephew's wedding in front of his boss." But the strangest thing happened with those words as I said them. They stopped being an apology midway through. "I don't have a title anymore." As though a title had ever been the architecture of a person rather than just the label on the door. My mother's voice moved somewhere beneath the words, and across the table, the calm, silver-haired man went very still. He set his glass down on the linen, slow and considered, and he looked at me with a quality of attention that I had not received from anyone in 3 years. Not the polite attention of people being kind to you, real attention, seeing me entirely, as though Carolyn had simply stopped existing beside him. "I don't think we've been properly introduced." He said, "What did you say your name was?" "My full name," Carolyn jumped in, because Carolyn cannot survive a silence she doesn't control. "Sinclair," she added quickly. "Diana Harlow," she kept our father's name. "Harlow," she said it like a correction, like a clarification, still trying to steer the boat. The man's eyes hadn't moved from my face. "Diana Harlow," he repeated, and I watched something surface in his expression, the way a specific memory surfaces when the right word finds it. Some file being retrieved from a very deep shelf. And then he said it, quietly, almost to himself first, and then aloud to me. Not the Diana Harlow, not the one who built the decision mapping framework. The table had been quiet before. Now it went completely still. The great aunt, both of Vivian's college friends, Jeffrey, the pleasant, quiet man, all of them stopped moving. Carolyn's hand found the back of the nearest chair, because those were words she had never in her life expected to hear attached to the sister she had spent years carefully miniaturizing. I felt my own pulse in my ears. I said carefully, I built a version of it, yes, a long time ago. And Richard Calloway, CEO of Apex Meridian Consulting, the firm my sister had organized her entire professional identity around, exhaled a short, surprised breath that was almost a laugh and shook his head slowly and said, "A long time ago. My entire analytics division still runs on your long time ago, Diana."
He told it simply and straightforwardly, which somehow made the impact more complete. He said that Apex Meridian had adopted my framework across the whole firm, that it was, in his words, the structural backbone of how they analyzed and made decisions at every level, and that when he had taken over as CEO 3 years ago, the very first outside hire he had wanted to make was the woman who had originally built it. He said, "Every single recruiting cycle for 3 years, I put your name at the top of the list and had my team try again." He said I had gone completely quiet, off every radar. No firm affiliation, no board positions, nothing. He said he had assumed I had been hired by a competitor under a confidentiality agreement or had taken something overseas. He said, "I could not understand how someone of your caliber simply disappears." And then I said it simply, because the simplest version was the true one. I said, "My mother got sick. I went home to take care of her. She died last year."
The words landed in the hall with a weight that even Carolyn could not talk over or around. Richard Calloway looked at me for a long and genuine moment. Then he said, "So while I had a team actively searching every major firm on the continent for you, you were where exactly?" And I said, "At a hospital, then at a funeral, then figuring out what came next." He nodded once, slowly, and something in his face shifted from professional interest into something rarer and more difficult to perform, something that looked like actual respect. And there was one more thing. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card, not to hand out, but to show. And he said, "I believe I've been reading your work, an anonymous strategy blog, a piece 3 weeks ago on decision behavior gaps." He turned the card over. On the back, he had written the URL of my blog and the initials RC. I stared at the card. RC. The 2 comments on my anonymous piece.
The ones that said whoever wrote this had done the thinking his entire firm's methodology rested on, standing in front of me, having found me not through a recruiting team after all, but through the work itself, the work I had been doing in the dark with no name on it, for no audience I knew of, simply because I could not make myself stop thinking. Carolyn had turned the specific shade of a person watching the floor disappear beneath them. Her hand was still on the back of that chair. She said, voice careful and too high, "Well, I mean, David, obviously that's all quite old work. The field has moved considerably since then. She's been out for years. You know how quickly things evolve." She said it reflexively, the shears still moving even as the ground collapsed, because some habits are stronger than self-preservation. Richard Calloway turned his head and looked at my sister. Really looked at her. The way you read a document a second time when you suspect you missed something important. The warmth that had been in his face when he spoke with her all evening was gone. Not into anger, into something cooler and more permanent. "Sandra," he started, then corrected himself. "Carolyn." His voice was quiet enough that the people 2 tables over would not have heard it clearly, but everyone at our table heard every word. He said, "I've watched how you speak about people in the office. I told myself it was competitive drive. I gave you room for it because results matter to me." He paused. "But I just watched you introduce your own sister, A woman whose intellectual work is literally the foundation my firm stands on, as unemployed and living off the family, at her son's wedding, to impress me. He let that sit in the air for a full 3 seconds. What that tells me about your judgment and your character is something I can't unknow. Carolyn's lips moved, but nothing came out. This is not the place, he continued, and I won't make it one. But I want you to know that HR will reach out on Monday morning, and I think on reflection you will understand why. He said it the way someone reads a line from a document they have already signed. No theatrics, no raised voice. The most powerful person in her professional world had simply and quietly and completely ended her standing in it. And the worst part for Carolyn was that there was no scene to recover from, no misunderstanding to clarify, because he had not been dramatic, he had been precise. Carolyn made a sound I had never heard from her, small and airless, like something deflating. And I will tell you what surprised me in that moment, because it surprised me too. I did not feel the flood I might have imagined, not the hot, bright rush of 3 years of being narrated and diminished and erased, finally being corrected in front of the right audience. What moved through me instead was something heavier and older. I looked at my sister's face coming apart in front of Vivian's family and my son, and I felt something closer to grief than victory, because a single quiet sentence from a powerful man had just undone a woman who had built her entire sense of herself on being the one who counted. And I understood, watching her, that I did not actually want her undone. I wanted something I did not yet have language for. The table shifted, the way tables shift at weddings when something has happened that nobody prepared for. Whispered conversations, chairs moving, someone going to find Marcus. My son appeared at the edge of it all, wide-eyed, looking between his aunt and his mother and his boss, with the face of a young man trying to understand how his wedding became this. Vivian reached me first. She came around the table and stood next to my chair and put one hand very lightly on my shoulder. A 26-year-old woman planting herself quietly beside the family member everyone else had spent years treating as background scenery. I will love her for that particular moment for the rest of my life. And Carolyn, my sister, sat down in the nearest available chair as though her legs had simply resigned, and she looked at me across the wreckage of her own construction, and something that had been hidden behind all her performances and her Navy cards and her careful cruelties surfaced plainly on her face, and she said, almost to herself, "You were always the one they remembered." It came out of her like something she'd been holding underwater since childhood. You were always the one they remembered. And in that one sentence, I finally understood the thing she had said on the phone 3 years ago, the quick, casual thing I hadn't been able to parse. She hadn't refused to care for our mother because she was heartless. She had refused because she was terrified that if she stepped out of her lit room for even a single moment, the world would simply forget she was there. The way she had always believed it defaulted to noticing me. Her cruelty had never been strength. It had been a woman clutching a rung in the rain, absolutely certain that releasing a single hand meant vanishing forever. I stood up. Everyone expected me to say something to Carolyn, I think. Some final accounting, some closing of the ledger she'd kept against me. I did not. I walked over to Richard Calloway and asked quietly if I could have a moment, and we stepped apart from the table, near a column wrapped in wisteria, the lake visible and dark beyond the open wall. Up close, he was even calmer, a man sufficiently accustomed to rooms rearranging around him that it no longer required any effort. He began to say that what I had built was remarkable, and that the firm owed me, and that he wanted to discuss what I might want. And I stopped him gently. "Mr. Calloway," I said, "I need to ask you something, and it's going to sound unusual." He waited with real patience. I said, "Please don't take action against my sister because of me." He tilted his head slightly. I said, "If she's crossed lines that your firm draws for its own reasons, that's your business and yours to address. But I need to know it isn't being given to me as a gift. I have spent 3 years being defined entirely by other people, having my story told by people who weren't in the room. I am not going to begin whatever comes next by having a woman's career destroyed on my behalf. That is not a win I want to own." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is genuinely considering what they just heard. And I realized as I said it, that I was not only talking about Carolyn. I was drawing a line about the entire way I intended to allow the world to hand me things from this point forward, whether insult or reward, and I meant to be the one holding the pen when those things were written. My whole body felt quiet and certain in a way it hadn't in years. I had just begun to become someone I hadn't been introduced to yet. Richard Calloway looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "The situation with your sister involves a pattern I've been watching for considerably longer than tonight. Tonight was simply the moment I stopped pretending I wasn't watching it." He said it with clarity and without malice. Then he made his offer. It was serious and it was substantial. He wanted me at Apex Meridian in a genuine leadership capacity, not a consulting contract. A seat at the actual top of the strategy function, running the whole analytical direction of the firm. He named figures, and the figures were significant enough that Jeffrey at our table, who was still in earshot, suddenly became very interested in his water glass. Richard said the firm would announce it however I wanted, that he would personally ensure the industry understood that Diana Harlow had returned, and that the record of her work would be properly corrected and credited in a single coordinated announcement. He would restore in the span of an afternoon everything the last 3 years had quietly taken from me. And then, to complete the offer, he reached into his jacket and produced one of his own cards, the heavy stock with his name and title, and set it down on the small cocktail table between us, right there where I could simply reach out and take it. A card. After an entire weekend of sitting empty-handed while my sister fanned hers like proof of existence, the most important man in the room was placing his card in front of me and offering to make me real again, on his terms. In his house, under his letterhead, I looked down at it for a long time. I want to tell you that I didn't consider it. That would be a lie, and this story has had quite enough of those for one weekend. I considered it, seriously and fully. Everything in me that had gone hungry for 3 years leaned toward that card. "Take it," said that part. "Take the title and the salary and the press release. Walk back into your former life fully vindicated. Let the industry that watched you disappear watch you return in triumph. Let Carolyn read about it in the trade publications. By every measurement I had used for 20 years, this was the win. It was the door I'd walked away from swinging open a second time, and this time there was no one dying on the other side of it. This time I could simply say yes. And my son would have a mother with the title again. And Vivian's father would know who he was dealing with. And the great aunt would revise every sentence she had ever spoken about me in past tense. Everything I had wanted at the beginning of that weekend was sitting in a small rectangle of heavy paper on a cocktail table by a lake. But wanting a thing and needing it are two entirely different ledgers. And my mother had spent her life teaching me to read a balance sheet carefully. If I took that card, I would once again be a woman whose worth arrived from outside herself, granted by someone with more current power than I had, printed on stock I had not chosen, restored by a press release with someone else's name at the top. I would be real again,
in exactly the way Carolyn measured real. I would win her arithmetic. And a person who wins the other person's game has still agreed to play on the other person's board. I looked at that card, and I heard my mother, clear as the last good week. They will measure you by the room you're standing in. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way. I understood, finally and completely, what she had been trying to give me.
It was not advice about other people's opinions. It was a statement about where the measuring instrument lives. Here is what those 2 years by a hospital bed had actually been teaching me, though it took a business card on a wedding table beside a lake for me to finally read the lesson all the way through. I had spent my entire professional life believing that my value was identical to the value I produced for other people. Build the framework, close the deal, run the room, generate the applause, and you are worth the applause you generate. Stop producing, and you are between things. That was the arithmetic. It was the same arithmetic Carolyn lived by, the same arithmetic that had made her refuse our mother, the same one that had her fanning her Navy cards like a life raft, the same one that had very nearly convinced me, sitting on the floor of my apartment with an old photograph, that a woman without a title was a woman without substance. But I had done the most valuable work of my life in a room that had no applause in it whatsoever. I had sat with my dying mother through 2 years that no one clapped for, that no one credited, that would never appear favorably on any document. And it had not been a gap in my life. It had been the fullest and most complete thing I had ever done. The world had categorized those years as empty. The world was wrong. And I had almost believed the world over the evidence of my own hands. My mother had seen it coming long before I did. Don't you dare measure yourself the same way. She was not telling me to build a larger room than Carolyn's. She was telling me to stop letting rooms do the measuring entirely. I picked up Richard Calloway's card. I held it long enough for him to understand that I fully recognized what I was refusing. Then I set it back down and slid it gently across the table to him. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it from the actual bottom of my chest. You have no idea what it means that you remembered. You found the work when I had stopped signing my name to it. You saw me when my own family had decided I was a lesson about what not to become. He waited with the patience of a good negotiator who knows something else is coming. I said, "But I'm not going to take the seat, and I need you to understand that it isn't pride." He held still. I said, "You offered to restore me, to correct the record and put me back where I belonged. But I didn't lose myself out there, Richard. I didn't get misplaced. This room simply forgot how to look. That was never my deficit to repair by accepting a better chair. I don't need to be restored. I need to build my own table. And I want it to be one where the first question isn't, 'What's your current title?' but 'What did you walk away from to do the thing that mattered?'" He was quiet for a long moment in the wisteria light by the lake. Then Richard Calloway did something I will always respect him for. He laughed. He said, "Most people take the chair, Diana. In 30 years in this industry, you are the first person I've made that offer to who said she'd rather build the room." He extended his hand. "Then I'll be your first client." He shook it firmly. And then he said, "And regarding your sister, Diana, what I'm doing with that situation, I'm doing for the integrity of my firm, for the people she has treated poorly over the years. Not for you. Exactly as you specified.
That distinction belongs to you." I shook his hand, and I had walked into that reception with nothing to offer anyone. And I was walking out having turned down what anyone in my world would have called everything. And I have never in my life, not once, felt richer in any way that counted.
I found Marcus near the wedding cake, standing with Vivian, looking like a young man whose beautiful day had developed an unexpected crack down the center. When he saw me walking toward him, his face asked 100 questions simultaneously. I took both his hands in mine. I told him that his wedding was still perfect and complete, and that nothing that had happened at that table tonight was his to carry or to grieve. I told him that his mother was more all right than she had been in 3 years, which was the truest thing I knew how to say in that moment. He asked me quietly if it was awful what he had walked into. I said, "No, sweetheart." I said, "I think it was the opposite of awful. I think tonight was the night your mother found herself again."
Vivian, hugged me, and over her shoulder I looked across the hall to where Carolyn sat alone at the empty table, her Navy cards nowhere in evidence, staring at nothing with the face of a woman whose story had just been rewritten by the audience she'd been performing for. I did not go to her. There was no repairing what existed between us in that room that night, perhaps not in any room for a long time. I had made my peace with that particular distance. But I found her eyes across the hall, and I gave her one small nod. Not forgiveness, not entirely. Something quieter and more honest than forgiveness. Acknowledgement. 2 sisters raised in the same household by the same invisible rules about who gets to matter and who does not, and only one of us had just walked free of all of it. She looked away first. Then I turned back to my son and his wife and took a fresh glass of something and let the wedding become a wedding again for whatever remained of the evening.
Later, when the dancing had properly started and no one needed anything from me, I stepped outside and stood alone in the lakeside dark for a while, listening to the music lean out of the open hall behind me and the water moving softly at the edge of the property. I had my mother's photograph in my purse. I took it out and looked at it under the distant lights, the 2 of us laughing at that long-ago conference. And I told her quietly in the dark that I had finally understood the things she'd been trying to hand me, and that I was sorry it had taken me the full 3 years to read it. For 3 years, I had walked out of rooms feeling myself grow smaller in the doorway each time, feeling the invisible arithmetic subtract me incrementally with every empty-handed departure. That night, I walked out of a room feeling exactly my own size for the first time since she died. I had no title. I had no card.
I had declined a fortune and a seat at the top of a table I had once built the foundation for, and I stood in the dark holding a photograph of a woman who had loved me enough to tell me the hard, true thing. And I was not between things. I was at the beginning of my own thing. The music played and the lights swayed on the water, and somewhere behind me my son was dancing with his wife, and my sister was gathering her coat and her cards and preparing to leave. And the world had not changed even a single degree. It was still measuring everyone by the rooms they stood in. But I had changed, all the way through, in every room I was made of. And that turned out to be the only measurement I had ever actually needed to correct. That night was just over a year ago. Here is what became of everyone since, because I know you want to know. I built the table I described to Richard.
Harlow strategy, small by design, 3 people and a focused set of clients. And Richard Calloway was true to every word, and became the first of them, which opened doors I didn't need to force or even fully knock on. It is not an empire. I have already done the version of my life that chases the largest room and the longest table, and I have no interest in returning to it. The firm is the right size. It is mine. It asks the questions I believe are worth asking, and it measures the things I believe are worth measuring. Carolyn left Apex Meridian that following Monday. The consulting world is not a large place, and the story of what happened at a lakeside wedding traveled in the way these stories do, quietly and completely. She landed at a smaller firm in another city, a rung lower than where she had been, still holding on, still doing the same arithmetic. We are not close. I have stopped performing the fiction that we will be at some future date.
Some fractures don't become stronger at the break. They simply stop bleeding, and you learn to live with the scar and the careful distance around it. And Vivian is pregnant. My son calls every week. He hugs me when I see him, like a man who has understood, finally and fully, what his mother is worth, and always was. And last month, I interviewed a woman for a position at Harlow Strategy who had been out of the workforce for 3 years while she cared for her father. Her hand shook slightly when she reached the gap on her resume, bracing herself for the question she had clearly been asked and had to explain too many times already. I did not ask her about the gap. I asked her to tell me about her father. She started to cry, and then she started to talk. And she talked for 20 minutes. And I knew I would hire her before she had finished the first 5. A business card fanned on white linen. A practiced laugh. A quiet man setting a glass down. These were the instruments.
But the music was something else entirely. If there is a quiet woman in your life holding more than any room has ever thought to look for, tell her today. Not tomorrow. Today. I'm Diana Harlow, and this has been Story Sentence. If this story reached something in you, please share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And leave me a comment telling me where you're watching from. I read every single one. I'll see you in the next story.